So, I want you to imagine that the year is 1865.
Okay.
And we are looking at a man who is currently, right at this moment, actively trying to figure out how to securely tie a heavy iron weight to his own feet.
Which is an incredibly dark image to start with.
It really is. He wants to throw himself into the Seine River, and he's doing the math to ensure he doesn't float back up.
Right.
And this isn't just some, fleeting intrusive thought. He is quite literally drowning in his own psychological despair.
Yeah.
Physically, the guy is deteriorating.
He's falling apart.
Exactly. He's going blind from eye strain. He is experiencing these vivid hallucinations, which are brought on by just the sheer stress of his daily existence and probably the highly questionable medical treatments of the 1860s.
Yeah, that definitely didn't help.
No. And he is pacing the floors of his estate, and he's screaming at his young, exhausted, pregnant wife.
Screaming that the last 7 years of his life.
Right. 7 years of grueling, agonizing, nonstop intellectual labor.
To produce nothing.
Nothing but completely worthless, irredeemable garbage. That's what he's calling it.
It's wild.
The man in this state of total collapse is Leo Tolstoy, and the quote-unquote worthless garbage that he is desperately attempting to destroy.
It happens to be the manuscript for War and Peace.
War and Peace.
It's a profoundly jarring image, especially when you consider the monumental, almost untouchable status that work holds today.
Oh, absolutely.
But the sheer visceral agony of that creation process, it isn't just a piece of historical literary trivia. It actually served as the perfect key to understanding what this text truly is.
Which is exactly what we're getting into today.
Right. Our mission for this deep dive is to fundamentally dismantle and reconstruct how you view this famously intimidating text.
Because I think most people just view it as a prop.
Exactly. If you treat War and Peace merely as a dusty, prolix Russian classic that functions as a sophisticated bookshelf ornament.
Or a doorstop.
Yeah, a doorstop. Then you fundamentally misunderstand its utility. We are examining a text that perfectly, almost surgically, diagnoses the very modern sensation of being helplessly overwhelmed by the torrent of history.
And that is precisely the angle we need to pursue here. Because if you are listening to this and you have found yourself looking around at the sheer velocity of the modern world,
which everyone has.
Right. If you feel like your agency is constantly being eroded by opaque algorithms or the exponential curve of AI or just the unyielding systemic political gridlock of our era.
It's exhausting.
It is. And if you are simply attempting to maintain some semblance of personal decency while stumbling through it all, then Tolstoy's Crisis in 1865 is directly speaking to you.
Over 150 years ago, he essentially authored a survival guide.
A survival guide for navigating that paralyzing modern alienation. The alienation that comes from realizing you are not the main character of history.
He was interrogating the exact sensation of history happening to you.
Rather than you happening to history.
Exactly. Rather than the comforting illusion that human choices neatly dictate historical outcomes. The ambition of what he was attempting to encapsulate the totality of human existence, the mechanics of war, the fragility of peace, the structures of society, and the deeply private spiritual terror of the individual within a single literary architecture.
It was physically breaking him.
Because he wasn't just writing a story. He was attempting to solve the philosophical problem of human agency.
So let's jump into the overview, and we're going to operate under the assumption that, the general historical backdrop here, which is the looming catastrophic shadow of Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia.
Right, that's the anger.
But what we really need to dissect is how Tolstoy manipulates that well-known timeline to serve his broader agenda.
The scope is massive.
It is. The book spans roughly 15 years, and it tracks these 5 prominent aristocratic families: the Bezukhovs, the Rostovs, the Bolkonskys, the Korygins, and the Drubetskoys.
But the structural rebellion of the book is what's truly fascinating.
Because he completely abandons the traditional narrative arc.
Totally. There is no single protagonist. There is no inciting incident in the classical sense.
It's a structural defiance that absolutely infuriated the literary establishment of his time.
Oh, they hated it. Tolstoy flat out refused to call War and Peace a novel.
Really?
Yeah. He argued that the European novel form was entirely inadequate for capturing the Russian experience or the reality of history. So he built a hybrid.
A very weird hybrid.
He weaves these dense, multi-generational familial dramas and then, without warning, completely halts the narrative momentum.
Just slams the brakes.
Slams the brakes to deliver 20-page historiographical polemics on the nature of power, or military strategy, or agricultural economics.
It is an attempt to map the entirety of the Russian consciousness. But surely that lack of traditional structure presents a narrative problem, right?
How so?
Well, if he is attempting to capture the totality of life, the ballrooms, the battlefields, the deathbeds, the political salons, how does he prevent the text from just collapsing under his own weight?
He has to anchor it.
Right. He has to anchor this massive philosophical exploration to specific human experiences. And that is where his manipulation of plot expectations becomes so subversive.
Let's give a quick warning here.
Oh, yeah. So, friendly heads up to you listening. We are about to dive into major plot points and spoilers for a 150-year-old book. But knowing the events honestly doesn't ruin the philosophy of the book at all.
Not even a little bit.
So take the trajectory of a character like Pierre Bezukhov.
Yes.
We all know Pierre's general arc. He's the illegitimate son who unexpectedly inherits the massive Bezukhov fortune.
Which renders him the wealthiest man in Russia literally overnight.
Overnight. But Tolstoy doesn't use that wealth to turn Pierre into a traditional power broker.
No, he uses it to amplify Pierre's existential paralysis.
Exactly. The sudden influx of unlimited capital and social status strips Pierre of any external excuses for his unhappiness.
He is forced into a state of pure, terrifying freedom.
And his reactions are disastrous.
Completely disastrous. He is manipulated into a hollow marriage with Helene Kuragina,
who was awful.
She embodies the cynical, superficial core of the Petersburg elite. But the true manifestation of Pierre's psychological displacement is his wandering onto the battlefield of Borodino.
This scene is unbelievable. This is a civilian wearing a white hat and a green swallowtail coat, casually riding a horse into one of the most mechanically slaughterous engagements of the 19th century.
It is such a surreal, almost hallucinatory sequence. He is walking through the Rievsky redoubt. Artillery shells are obliterating the earth around him. Men are being torn apart.
And Pierre's just standing there.
Just observing, trying to find some grand unifying meaning in the violence.
He is the ultimate seeker, armed with entirely the wrong tools.
Exactly.
But I want to push back on Tolstoy's ultimate resolution for these characters, because we track Pierre through his disastrous marriage, his obsession with Freemasonry, his capture by the French, his grueling experience as a prisoner of war.
Right.
And we track Natasha Rostova from her incandescent youth, that vital spark she possesses, through her social annihilation after the scandal with Anatol Kuragin.
To her profound moral awakening.
Right, when she forces her family to abandon their worldly possessions to use their carts for wounded soldiers.
And we track Prince Andrei's cynical descent and his final deathbed spiritual clarity.
Yes, and yet the ending. The famous epilogue.
People hate the epilogue.
It has frustrated critics for over a century. After all of this epic, sweeping historical trauma, Tolstoy settles Pierre and Natasha into a fiercely domestic, almost aggressively mundane family life.
It feels contradictory to a lot of readers.
Doesn't it? He spends thousands of pages deconstructing the machinery of empires, only to conclude that the ultimate victory is checking your children's diapers and managing estate finances.
That frustration you are identifying is exactly the tension that drives the novel, and it is a distinctly modern frustration.
Why modern?
Because we are conditioned to expect our protagonists to achieve some form of grand, world-altering victory, or a dramatically tragic demise. We want them to leave a scar on history.
We want the cinematic ending.
But Tolstoy's thesis is that leaving a scar on history is a false idol. It is the very ambition that creates Napoleons and the subsequent slaughter of millions.
So the domesticity isn't a surrender.
Not at all.
It's a repudiation of the historical ego.
Precisely. Tolstoy is arguing that true, profound maturity is the painful acceptance of your own microscopic place in the universe.
Wow.
The epilogues focus on domestic routine, Natasha becoming fiercely protective of her family, Pierre engaging in quiet, localized political dissent rather than grand revolutionary violence. Is Tolstoy positing that the only ethical response to the uncontrollable flood of history is to fiercely cultivate the localized garden of human connection?
The daily, unglamorous responsibilities.
Caring for the people immediately adjacent to you is not a retreat from the world. For Tolstoy, it is the only authentic way to live in it.
It is the rejection of the abstract concept of humanity in favor of the concrete human.
Exactly.
That reframes the entire climax of the book. It makes the mundane incredibly subversive.
It really does.
But to truly understand why Tolstoy possessed such a pathological need to tear down the illusions of grand historical narratives, we have to look closely at the architect himself.
Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy.
Because he did not arrive at this philosophy from a place of ascetic detachment. He arrived at it through a life built upon a foundation of staggering, almost unendurable moral guilt.
The psychological torment of his biography is the shadow text of War and Peace.
Let's get into his youth.
Well, he was born into the absolute highest echelon of the Russian nobility. He was orphaned young, his mother passed when he was 2, his father when he was 9.
Which is incredibly traumatic.
And he inherited the massive Yasnaya Polyana estate, along with hundreds of human beings legally bound to the land as serfs. He was groomed for a life of idle aristocratic consumption.
And man, he indulged in it heavily during his youth.
Oh, big time.
If you read his diaries from his time as a university student in Kazan and later in the salons of Moscow and St. Petersburg, they're essentially a ledger of debauchery.
Just massive gambling debts.
Excessive gambling debts, drinking, and a relentless pursuit of localized pleasures.
But simultaneously, those same diaries reveal a man who is actively loathing himself for every single indulgence.
He was acutely, painfully aware that his ability to sit in a beautifully appointed parlor reading French philosophy was directly subsidized by the bodily suffering of the serfs working his fields.
Think about that connection for a second. Have you ever had everything you were supposed to want, yet felt completely hollow and self-loathing inside?
That was Tolstoy at age 22.
It was a cognitive dissonance that threatened to tear his psyche apart. He drafted endless obsessive rules for his own moral conduct.
Like what?
Lists of how many hours to study, how little to eat, how to suppress his physical desires, and he would inevitably break them within hours.
Which led to fresh waves of self-flagellation.
He was trapped in the structural contradictions of his class. He despised the exploitation of the serfs, yet he repeatedly failed in his early, clumsy attempts to reform his estate.
Because he fundamentally didn't understand the people he owned.
Exactly. It's the classic paralysis of the privileged intellectual. You have the total systemic awareness of the injustice, but you are entirely dependent on the system for your own survival and comfort.
So how does a man with that specific psychological profile break the circuit?
He leaves the parlor and throws himself into the meat grinder.
At age 23, fleeing his gambling debts and his own existential dread, Tolstoy joins the Russian army as an artillery officer.
He heads to the Caucasus.
And eventually into the crucible of the Crimean War, specifically the brutal siege of Sevastopol.
And this military service is the crucible that forges the realism of War and Peace.
Because he didn't just read about it.
Right. Tolstoy did not observe war from a safe, strategic distance like a staff officer, nor did he read about it in romanticized dispatches. He was in the bastions of Sevastopol under heavy, continuous bombardment.
He saw the grim, unromantic mechanics of 19th century warfare firsthand.
He witnessed the horrific conditions of the field hospitals. Amputations without proper anesthesia, the slow, agonizing deaths from sepsis and gangrene.
Which completely explains the visceral, de-romanticized combat sequences in the novel.
Yeah.
When we read the descriptions of the Battle of Schöngrabern or Austerlitz, we aren't reading Victor Hugo.
No.
We are reading the tactical reality of a man who knows exactly what a severed horse limb looks like and exactly what an artillery barrage smells like.
He systematically strips away the glory of the cavalry charge and replaces it with the sheer blinding confusion of the men on the ground.
He fundamentally altered the literary depiction of combat with this.
He recognized that the narrative of a battle, the neat lines on a general's map, the strategic maneuvers, is an absolute fiction imposed after the fact to make sense of pure chaos.
Because a soldier in the line has no concept of the overall strategy.
None. He only knows the smoke, the noise, and the terror of the man dying next to him. Tolstoy brought that epistemological limit to the reader. But capturing that level of granular, chaotic reality, while simultaneously weaving a 15-year narrative involving hundreds of characters, requires a level of logistical execution that Tolstoy, honestly, was probably incapable of managing alone.
Given his psychological volatility, absolutely.
We cannot discuss the architecture of this novel without pivoting to the absolute bedrock upon which it was constructed. We have to discuss Sophia Behrs.
Sophia.
Because it is no exaggeration to say that without her, War and Peace does not exist.
The erasure of Sophia's intellectual and physical labor from the popular mythology of the lone male genius is a profound historical injustice.
It really is. Sophia married Tolstoy when she was just 18 years old.
While he was 34.
and their union was immediately fraught with his psychological heavy-handedness. On the eve of their wedding, he forced her to read his diaries.
The diaries detailing all of his past infidelities and moral failures?
He believed that total, unfiltered honesty was necessary.
Which is a completely devastating burden to place on an 18-year-old. But her response wasn't to crumble. She possessed staggering fortitude.
Once he began writing the manuscript that would become War and Peace, her role transcended that of a mere supportive spouse.
She became his primary editor.
His sounding board.
And his literal transcription engine. The physical reality of her labor is difficult to comprehend in the digital age.
Tolstoy's handwriting was notoriously, hopelessly illegible.
It was a chaotic scrawl filled with aggressive crossouts, marginalia, and sprawling revisions.
He would hand her pages covered in an impenetrable thicket of ink.
And Sophia would sit up deep into the night, illuminating the pages with candlelight, and painstakingly decipher and copy the manuscript into a readable draft so it could be sent to the publisher.
And we're not talking about a quick polish. She copied the entirety of this massive, multi-thousand-page manuscript by hand.
7 times.
7 times. Some estimates say certain sections were rewritten and copied up to 20 times.
And she was doing this grueling, eye-straining physical labor while actively managing the massive Yasnaya Polyana estate.
Because Tolstoy was too consumed by the book to handle the agricultural economic.
Oh, and she was also constantly pregnant or nursing infants during this entire period.
She was the structural integrity holding his chaotic genius together. When he would descend into his cyclical depressions, convinced the work was worthless garbage, like you mentioned at the start of our deep dive, she was the one who maintained the forward momentum.
She pushed through cramped fingers and the exhaustion of early motherhood because she recognized the transcendent value of the work, even when he could not.
She is the unsung hero of global literature.
Absolutely. And the fact that they were executing this monumental task in the 1860s adds a crucial layer of historical dissonance to the text itself.
Oh, so?
Well, Tolstoy is writing War and Peace in 1865, but he was writing about the period between 1805 and 1820.
Right.
He is looking back at the defining trauma of his parents' generation through the lens of a society that is undergoing a massive foundational collapse in the present.
The temporal gap between the setting and the composition is vital. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II issued the Emancipation Reform,
officially abolishing serfdom across the Russian Empire.
It was a seismic shift in the economic and social fabric of the nation. The aristocratic class was suddenly unmoored, their entire way of life permanently disrupted.
So when Tolstoy is writing about the glittering balls in St. Petersburg in 1805, or the massive estates of the Rostovs and the Bolkonskis, he isn't writing simple historical fiction.
He is writing an autopsy of a doomed society.
He is capturing the apex of aristocratic privilege, while fully aware that the foundation beneath it, the labor of the serfs, is fundamentally illegitimate and destined to collapse.
This imbues the novel with incredible moral complexity.
Because he doesn't resort to simple didacticism.
No, he doesn't paint the Rostovs or the Bolkonskis as one-dimensional evil oppressors. He shows them as deeply human, capable of profound love, intense spiritual searching, and incredible bravery.
Yet he never lets the reader forget the economic reality that sustains them.
When Count Rostov throws a massive, lavish banquet, Tolstoy ensures we understand the scale of the agricultural extraction required to fund that single evening.
It forces you into a state of uncomfortable complicity as a reader.
You find yourself deeply invested in whether Natasha will find happiness or whether Nikolai Rostov can pay off his gambling debts, while simultaneously recognizing that their problems are insulated by a system of human bondage.
It is a masterful manipulation of empathy.
And that tension bleeds directly into the central obsessive theme of the entire work, the dialectic of free will versus determinism.
This is where Tolstoy shifts from being a novelist to a philosopher of history.
He was reacting aggressively against the dominant historiographical model of his time, specifically Thomas Carlyle's great man theory of history.
Right, the great man theory. The comforting, slightly narcissistic idea that the trajectory of human civilization is dictated by the sheer will and genius of a few extraordinary individuals.
Napoleon points his finger toward Moscow, and the world pivots on its axis.
Alexander the Great desires an empire, and history bends to accommodate him.
Tolstoy looked at that theory and essentially called it a dangerous infantile delusion.
His rejection of it is total.
He argued that the concept of a singular leader steering history is an optical illusion created by historians who need a neat narrative.
Because in reality, Tolstoy posits, history is the emergent property of an infinite number of infinitesimal human actions.
It is a deterministic framework, but not in a divine sense. It is a mathematical determinism.
He literally uses the metaphor of calculus in the text, doesn't he?
Yes. He compares history to differential equations. He argues that just as calculus integrates infinitesimally small quantities to understand a continuous curve, the true historian must integrate the infinitesimally small actions of the masses to understand the movement of history.
So Napoleon didn't command the French army to march into Russia.
Rather, the combined unconscious desires, economic pressures, and minute decisions of hundreds of thousands of French soldiers and citizens created a historical current so powerful that Napoleon was simply swept along at the front of it.
Under the illusion that he was steering.
Exactly.
Let's ground that abstract philosophy in the text itself. Consider how he portrays Napoleon before the Battle of Austerlitz, or Borodino.
He doesn't depict him as a grand, imposing genius.
No, he depicts him as a slightly plump, arrogant man, sniffing eau de cologne, suffering from a cold.
Issuing orders that are either entirely irrelevant by the time they reach the front lines or are completely ignored by the soldiers actually doing the fighting.
He ruthlessly strips away the mythology of leadership.
Tolstoy actually wrote that a king is history's slave. The higher up you are on the hierarchy of power, the less actual free will you possess, because your actions are entirely constrained and dictated by the collective momentum of the masses beneath you.
This is where the text becomes alarmingly relevant to you listening today. We may not be dealing with emperors and cavalry charges, but we are absolutely wrestling with the exact same structural anxieties.
Substitute the momentum of the masses with the opaque, algorithmic architecture of the modern internet.
Right. Substitute it with the decentralized, catastrophic momentum of climate change or the impenetrable complexities of global supply chains.
The parallel is exact. When you are looking at your phone, feeling a sense of dread about the polarization of society or the shifting global climate, you are experiencing the Tolstoyan historical flood.
You recognize that you, as an individual, cannot issue a command to stop it.
No politician can simply pass a law that instantly rewires the collective human trajectory. We are caught in the current.
But if we accept Tolstoy's premise that individual choices don't steer the macro history, doesn't that plunge us directly into nihilism?
It sounds like it would.
Doesn't that absolve us of moral responsibility? I mean, why does he spend 1,000 pages judging his character's individual moral choices if those choices ultimately have no historical weight?
Because you are confusing historical weight with moral weight. And this is the genius of Tolstoy's structural equality between the macro and the micro.
Explain that.
He insists that while your choices may not alter the grand geopolitical narrative, they possess absolute, unyielding moral significance in the private sphere.
The juxtaposition of chapters is the best evidence of this.
Yes.
You will read a deeply researched, heavily tactical chapter detailing the crossing of the Niemen River by hundreds of thousands of troops, a movement that will end the lives of countless men.
And the very next chapter will be a deeply intimate, psychologically microscopic examination of Natasha Rostova feeling a rush of inexplicable joy at a name day party or agonizing over the subtle social cues of a dance. Critics at the time attacked this pacing as amateurish. They felt it trivialized the historical events to place them adjacent to teenage romance. But Tolstoy is executing a deliberate philosophical leveling.
He is forcing the reader to accept that the ontological weight of an empire collapsing is no greater than the ontological weight of a young woman's spiritual awakening.
The private life is the real history.
Which perfectly transitions us into the lives of the individuals carrying that moral weight. Let's dive deeply into the psychological profiles of the three central pillars of this novel.
Because they are not archetypes. They are agonizingly real, contradictory human beings.
Let's return to Pierre Bezukhov. We discussed his initial displacement, his wealth, his disastrous marriage to Helene.
Right.
But his true function in the novel is the relentless, almost exhausting pursuit of an authentic life.
Pierre is the embodiment of the epistemological crisis of the 19th century intellectual.
He is desperate for a system, any system, that will organize the chaos of the world into a coherent moral framework.
When his marriage collapses and he nearly kills a man in a duel, he is completely unmoored, and so he turns to Freemasonry.
The Masonic sequences in the novel are fascinating.
He is blindfolded, subjected to these elaborate rituals, and fed a rhetoric of universal brotherhood and moral perfection.
And for a brief window, he is entirely radicalized by it. He believes he has found the ultimate truth.
He returns to his estates with these grand, sweeping plans to build hospitals, emancipate his serfs, and create a utopian agrarian society.
Yet, It completely fails.
Why does it fail?
It fails because Pierre approaches it as an abstract theory. He issues orders to his managers and feels a warm glow of philanthropic virtue, but he doesn't actually understand the granular reality of the serfs' lives.
His managers easily deceive him, the serfs are actually worse off, and Pierre's ideological certainty evaporates.
It is Tolstoy demonstrating the futility of trying to impose top-down, abstract philosophical systems onto the messy reality of human life.
His search becomes increasingly desperate, culminating in that deranged period during the French occupation of Moscow.
Oh man, this part is crazy.
He convinces himself, through an absurd numerological manipulation of the Book of Revelation, that he is the prophesied assassin destined to kill Napoleon.
He is wandering the burning streets of Moscow with a dagger in his coat.
A wealthy intellectual playing at being a revolutionary martyr.
And of course, he fails to even get close to Napoleon. Instead, he is arrested for intervening in a scuffle and is thrown into a shed as a prisoner of war.
He is stripped of his title, his immense wealth, his tailored clothes, and his intellectual pretensions.
He is reduced to an animal state of survival, facing a French firing squad and watching men be executed inches away from him.
And it is exactly there, at the absolute nadir of his existence, marching in the freezing mud with the retreating French army, that Pierre finally achieves the psychological peace he has been agonizing over for a decade.
And he doesn't learn it from a philosopher or a Masonic text.
No.
He learns it from Pleton Karatev.
Pleton Karatev is a crucial, heavily symbolic figure in the novel. He is an illiterate peasant soldier, captured alongside Pierre.
Tolstoy describes him as entirely round his head, his back, his simple, contained philosophy of life.
Platon doesn't agonize over the meaning of history. He accepts his suffering. He finds joy in the immediate sensations of life, a warm baked potato, the sewing of a shirt.
And he possesses a deep, intuitive, unintellectualized love for existence itself.
He is the antidote to Pierre's modern, overanalyzed alienation.
Platon teaches Pierre that meaning isn't something you discover through intellectual conquest. It is something you inhabit through simple, localized action and an acceptance of the present moment.
It's a profound unlearning for Pierre.
It forces Pierre to realize that all his desperate searching for a grand purpose was actually a barrier to experiencing life.
The modern equivalent is striking.
Yeah, think about it. If you've ever found yourself doom-scrolling at 3 a.m. asking what the point is,
Flitting from one ideological subculture to another, looking for a quick fix to your existential dread.
it's a mirror held up to our own algorithm-driven search for identity. We join online movements, adopt hyper-specific aesthetic labels, hoping they will shield us from the chaos, only to find them hollow.
Pierre's journey insists that peace is found in the shedding of those abstract identities.
Now contrast Pierre's heavy, intellectualized struggle with the visceral, intuitive energy of Natasha Rostova.
Natasha.
If Pierre represents the agonizing search for truth, Natasha represents the sheer, unadulterated force of life itself.
Natasha is arguably one of the most vital, vividly drawn female characters in all of 19th century literature. Tolstoy captures the essence of her youth with astonishing precision.
Consider the iconic scene of her first grand ball.
Tolstoy doesn't just describe the dresses and the music, he captures the hyperventilating terror of the 13-year-old girl convinced that no one will ask her to dance.
That she will be left on the periphery of life.
And when Prince Andrei finally does ask her to dance, the prose literally accelerates.
You feel the euphoric rush of validation, the sudden, expanding realization of her own power and beauty. She is completely, dangerously open to the world.
But that exact openness, that lack of cynical armor, is what makes her so vulnerable to the predations of Petersburg society.
Her downfall is orchestrated by Anatol Kuragin, a man who views human beings entirely as instruments for his own immediate gratification.
And the way Tolstoy sets up her seduction is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He uses the setting of the opera house.
Yes, the opera scene. This is where Tolstoy deploys that incredible literary technique, ostrany.
Or defamiliarization.
Right. He describes the opera not as a grand emotional performance, but as a ridiculous artificial construct of painted cardboard, fat men in tights waving their arms, and meaningless shrieking.
He forces the reader to see the inherent absurdity of the artifice.
He defamiliarizes the opera to mirror Natasha's own moral disorientation. Surrounded by the cynical, artificial high society in the theater, the moral rules she was raised with suddenly seem as absurd and constructed as the painted cardboard on the stage.
In that state of disorientation, Anatol's aggressive, physical charisma overwhelms her.
She agrees to elope with him. a decision that results in absolute social ruin.
The cruelty of that society is that it permits men like Anatole to ruin young women without consequence, while Natasha is subjected to total social annihilation.
She attempts suicide. She spirals into a devastating physical and spiritual depression.
But crucial to Tolstoy's vision, she does not remain a tragic victim.
The crucible of the war, the burning of Moscow, forces her out of her own internalized shame.
When she coordinates the use of the Rostov family carts to transport the wounded soldiers, abandoning the family's wealth to the fire, we are witnessing the solidification of her moral core.
She transitions from a state of selfish, demanding vitality to a state of selfless, enduring strength.
She becomes the caretaker of the dying Prince Andrei, confronting the physical reality of death with an unflinching grace that Pierre couldn't even fathom at that point.
Which brings us to the third point in this profound triangle. Prince Andrei Bolkonsky. If Pierre is the seeker and Natasha is the vital life force, Andrei is the ultimate disillusioned achiever.
He is the man of fierce intellect, rigid discipline, and intense ambition.
Andrei represents the aristocratic ideal, but an ideal that has turned sour and cynical. He begins the novel deeply contemptuous of the superficial society he inhabits.
And deeply contemptuous of his own pregnant wife.
He believes that the only sphere worthy of his intellect is the sphere of grand historical action.
He goes to war not out of patriotism, but out of a burning desire for personal glory, explicitly modeling his ambition on Napoleon.
He wants his Toulon, his moment of singular genius that will elevate him above the masses.
And this driving, egoic ambition sets up what is perhaps the single most famous philosophical set piece in the entire novel, the scene on the battlefield of Austerlitz.
It is a moment of devastating, paradigm-shifting clarity.
Andrei leads a charge, banner in hand, striving for that moment of heroic immortality. He is struck down, severely wounded.
And as he lies bleeding on the battlefield, the cacophony of the war, the shouting, the artillery, the chaos he had so desperately wanted to master fades into the background. He rolls onto his back and simply looks up.
And we have to talk about the imagery here, because it is transcendent.
He looks up and realizes how quiet, peaceful, and solemn the sky is. Not at all like the shouting and fighting below.
He wonders how he never saw that lofty sky before, and realizes that all the glory he chased is just vanity. All is falsehood, except that infinite sky.
That realization systematically dismantles his entire worldview.
The infinite, indifferent expanse of the sky reduces Napoleon, the battle, and his own burning ambition to the level of microscopic, meaningless insect struggles.
When Napoleon himself rides past the wounded Andrei and utters a grand historical pronouncement about a fine death, Andrei literally cannot be bothered to care.
Napoleon, his former idol, seems entirely small and ridiculous compared to the infinite void.
But the tragedy of Andrei is that this revelation doesn't bring him peace.
No, it brings him a cold, detached nihilism.
He returns home just in time to watch his wife die in childbirth, an event that solidifies his belief that life is merely a brutal, senseless, mechanical process.
Even his subsequent romance with Natasha only briefly thaws his heart. And when she betrays him with Anatole, his pride hardens into an impenetrable shell of unforgiving bitterness.
Andrei achieves a form of enlightenment, but it is a sterile intellectual enlightenment.
It lacks the messy, forgiving warmth of Platon, Karateev, or Pierre.
It is only at the very end, when he is mortally wounded at Borodino and lying in a field hospital next to the agonizingly amputated Anatole Kuragin, the man he swore to kill, that his intellectual armor finally breaks.
He looks at Anatole not with hatred, but with a sudden, overwhelming wave of divine, unconditional love.
He finally understands that the only defense against the indifferent sky is the absolute, egoless forgiveness of other flawed human beings.
But as you said earlier about the expectations of a novel, it's almost too late.
Right. He achieves this spiritual perfection, and then he immediately dies.
He cannot carry that perfection back into the messy reality of living, which is why Pierre and Natasha must be the ones to carry the narrative forward into the epilogue.
Andrei is the warning. He is the man who achieved all the structural markers of success: military rank, intellectual superiority, societal respect, and realized it was an empty vessel.
His trajectory asks you a deeply uncomfortable question. If you climb to the very top of your ambition and you look up to find nothing but the indifferent sky, what sustains you?
Tolstoy argues that if your answer isn't localized human connection, you will freeze to death in your own cynicism.
The way Tolstoy engineers these psychological epiphanies brings us to the actual mechanics of his prose. The style and literary techniques he deployed were just as revolutionary as his philosophy.
We've touched on his defamiliarization and his battlefield realism, but we really need to emphasize his absolute mastery of interiority.
He was pioneering narrative techniques that wouldn't even be categorized for another half-century.
What you're referring to is his early, sophisticated use of stream of consciousness.
Long before James Joyce or Virginia Woolf codified the technique, Tolstoy was using it to map the chaotic, nonlinear progression of human thought.
When Pierre is riding in a carriage after his duel, or when he is spiraling in his study at 3 a.m., Tolstoy doesn't summarize his thoughts.
He puts the raw, fragmented, contradictory associations directly onto the page. You experience the exact cadence of a mind trying and failing to logically order its own panic.
It creates an almost terrifying level of psychological intimacy. You aren't reading about Pierre's anxiety, you are inhabiting it.
And he contrasts this deep, microscopic psychological realism with the massive, sweeping, God's eye view of the historical essays. The narrative whiplash is intense.
That's completely intentional. We have to defend the so-called formlessness of the novel, the critics who attack the structure, the sudden 10-page interruptions where Tolstoy lectures the reader on the mechanics of power or the failures of military historians miss the point entirely.
They wanted a perfectly manicured French garden of a novel. Tolstoy was giving them an unmapped Russian forest.
Life doesn't adhere to a three-act structure. Life is a series of banal moments, interrupted by profound tragedies, which are in turn interrupted by historical forces beyond our control.
The chaotic, sprawling, deeply frustrating structure of War and Peace is a physical manifestation of Tolstoy's philosophy. The lack of a neat narrative bow is the thesis.
It forces you into an active rather than passive engagement with the text. You have to wrestle with the philosophy to earn the emotional payoff of the characters' arcs.
But as we know, this radical approach did not win him immediate universal acclaim.
The reception, both then and the evolution of its legacy now, is a fascinating study in how art is digested by culture.
The initial backlash from the literary heavyweights of the era was shockingly brutal. You have to remember, Tolstoy was already a respected figure. The Russian intelligentsia was waiting for his definitive masterpiece.
And when the serialized chunks of War and Peace began landing, they were appalled by the hubris of the structure.
Ivan Turgenev, who was essentially the elder statesman of Russian letters at the time, was scathing.
He called the historical and philosophical digressions charlatanism. He stated that the novel was boring and suffered from a complete lack of architecture.
And the French literary establishment was equally perplexed. Gustave Flaubert, the architect of the perfectly structured Madame Bovary, praised Tolstoy's psychological insight but vehemently attacked his lack of discipline,
complaining that he repeats himself and philosophizes far too much.
The general consensus among the elite was that Tolstoy had produced a brilliant but fundamentally broken and undisciplined mess.
But the true tragedy, the ultimate irony of the novel's reception, didn't come from Turgenev or Flaubert. It came from Tolstoy himself.
Because as he aged, Tolstoy underwent a profound, radical, and ultimately destructive spiritual and existential crisis.
This is the era detailed in his work, A Confession. He achieves global fame, immense wealth, a large family, everything the secular world deems necessary for happiness, and he is paralyzed by the realization that death renders all of it fundamentally meaningless.
He embraces a severe ascetic interpretation of Christianity. He renounces his wealth, attempts to give away his copyrights, becomes a radical pacifist and a vegetarian, and completely rejects the entire foundation of his previous life.
And as a necessary consequence of this radical ideological purity, he must reject his own art.
He looks back at War and Peace, the work that cost him 7 years of agony and his wife's eyesight, and he publicly disowns it.
He dismisses it as aristocratic rubbish.
He views it as morally bankrupt because it focuses on the frivolous worldly problems of the privileged elite, rather than serving as a clear, didactic moral tract for the peasantry.
The creator of the work that defines the pinnacle of the novel form genuinely believed his masterpiece was a failure of moral character.
It is a devastating testament to the danger of ideological absolutism. Tolstoy, the religious zealot, could not tolerate the beautiful, messy, contradictory humanity that Tolstoy, the artist, had captured so perfectly.
But of course, the arc of history, which Tolstoy so brilliantly analyzed, did not bend to his own harsh self-assessment. The legacy of the work outlived the creator's disdain.
The generational shift in the critical reception is absolute. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, and the modernist movement began explicitly trying to capture the fragmented psychological reality of modern life, they looked back at War and Peace not as a broken 19th century novel, but as the first true modern text.
The titans of modernism revered it. James Joyce drew heavily on Tolstoy's stream of consciousness.
Marcel Proust's exploration of memory and high society owes a massive debt to Tolstoy's social autopsies.
And Virginia Woolf, who was deeply critical of the Edwardian literary establishment, famously declared Tolstoy to be the greatest of all novelists.
Specifically citing his ability to capture the terrifying, complex totality of human psychology.
And its cultural footprint today is ubiquitous. It has become the universal linguistic shorthand for impossibly large ambition.
If a piece of legislation is too complex, or a movie script is too long, we immediately deploy the phrase, "It's the War and Peace up, whatever."
It survives in endless, lavish BBC adaptations. It survives despite its intimidating page count, despite its philosophical lectures, and despite the tragic hatred of its own author.
It survives because the underlying diagnostic framework it provides is still accurate. So if we synthesize this massive, sprawling exploration, what is the core utility of this deep dive for the listener navigating their own modern chaos?
The ultimate lesson circles back to our initial premise. The real story of human history is not being dictated by the emperors, the tech billionaires, or the politicians.
Those figures are merely surfing the crest of a wave created by the collective momentum of millions of microscopic human choices.
The real story of history is the individual, everyday person struggling to figure out how to maintain decency, integrity, and human connection in a world that feels overwhelmingly large and terrifyingly indifferent.
You do not need to alter the global geopolitical landscape to live a life of profound moral weight. Pierre Bezukhov never formulated a grand unified theory of existence.
Natasha Rostova made catastrophic, deeply humiliating mistakes.
But their lives matter deeply because they eventually learn to direct their energy toward the immediate, tangible reality of the people in front of them.
Tolstoy teaches us that the flood of history is inevitable, but your localized choices, your decision to forgive a friend, to care for a sick relative, to engage honestly with the person next to you, are the only true bulwarks against the chaos.
So as we conclude, I want to pull you back to that initial haunting image. Tolstoy in 1865, consumed by despair, screaming that his work is worthless garbage.
Actively contemplating the Seine River and the heavy weight.
The darkness was absolute. The certainty of his own failure was total. But despite all of that, he sat back down at his desk.
He kept writing. He allowed Sophia to painstakingly copy it out one more time. He pushed through the paralyzing doubt to make one more honest, agonizing effort.
He created something immortal not because he was confident in its immortality, but because he endured the process of its creation despite his own psychological terror.
And so, the question I want to leave you with right now in your own life is this. What are you abandoning because you have convinced yourself it won't be good enough?
What project, what necessary difficult conversation, what attempt to change your own trajectory are you giving up on simply because the weight of it feels too heavy and the outcome feels too uncertain?
It is a question that demands rigorous self-examination. And to frame that examination, consider this final provocative thought.
If Leo Tolstoy, a man recognized globally as one of the most acute, penetrating psychological observers in the history of human civilization, could be so profoundly wrong about the value of his own creation.
If he could look at the greatest novel ever written and genuinely believe it was trash, then how much trust should you really place in the destructive voice of your own inner critic today?
That is the ultimate revelation. You are inherently incapable of being the final judge of your own impact.
Your messy, fumbling attempts to build a life, to be decent, to create something of value, they might be assembling a legacy that you simply lack the perspective to see.
So ignore the paralyzing certainty of the critic.
Keep making those microscopic choices. Keep fighting for connection amidst the chaos of history. And above all, keep reading. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.